Hey everyone, Andang here for a video on LOTRO's future. So recently I've been getting a lot of comments saying that, well, Andang, the ring's been destroyed. It's no longer with us. So what is going to be going on with the story now that that's gone? Sauron's been defeated. There's nothing left to tell. It doesn't matter that there's literally a third of Return of the King left to go. That doesn't matter, Andang, because the main villain's gone. It's over. LOTRO's done. There is no more LOTRO to come because the story's basically done. Sure, they are going to tie up a few things, have hobbits drink and laugh a little bit, but other than that, everything's pretty much done. It's not like that there's still a whole main villain that had his own tower that still needs to be dealt with or anything, right? Except that's actually exactly the case because Saruman hasn't been defeated yet. He's not defeated until after the events of the Scouring of the Shire. And so until the Scouring of the Shire is over, Saruman, one of the two main villains who had his own tower, and was one of the two towers, has still not yet been defeated. And so the entire War of the Ring is technically not over, according to Tolkien, until after the Scouring of the Shire. So we're not even done with the war that we're in right now yet, until Saruman is defeated at the Scouring of the Shire. Well, okay, Andang, we all knew that the Scouring of the Shire was going to be happening, but after that, no more story. There's nothing else they could possibly tell. All the evil's been destroyed. It's not like that there's an entire unknownly large kingdom to the south of Gondor that could be a big threat or anything. Well, except there is a whole land to still deal with, and that is Harad, which is to the south of Gondor, which you can now see on this map. There is this entire area of Harad, which is massive. In fact, we technically don't even know for sure if Harad doesn't even continue way further south, which LOTRO could explore. Who says that LOTRO needs to be bound by the borders of this map? They could go further because we know that there's blue wizards and easterlings off into the east potentially, and so they could go off and try to figure out all the stuff with the easterlings and things like that off this map. They could go down south beyond Harad and see things farther south than that. There's literally no limits to how much content they could have, and it could go on literally forever. But forget about that for a moment. Let's just take Middle-earth itself. If you look at the areas we've been, there's actually more landscape in Middle-earth that we've not seen yet than what we've seen, as far as actual landmass goes. And so there is more of Middle-earth yet to be explored than what we've currently explored. And part of that is because we've only spent 7.5 months in Middle-earth in the in-game Middle-earth time. Yeah, that's correct. We've only spent 7.5 months in Middle-earth inside LOTRO. And so, moving forward the timeline a bit, Gondor does eventually go to war with Harad and actually takes over this entire small area called Harandir between these two rivers, and then continues down the coastline to take basically the entire coastline of Harad. The interior of Harad still stays unconquered, but it's quite possible that our player characters could go in and do all sorts of scouting or just different missions and things like that inside Harad, which would be really cool, I think. Not only does Gondor conquer all this land to the south, they also conquer all of Rhûn. So this entire area over here, they conquer all that, and then they make peace with the Easterlings. But again, we could go off the map and go and figure out what's going on with the Easterlings far to the east, and then maybe even meet up with blue wizards and do all sorts of other cool stuff, which would be awesome. But that's not even all Gondor does. Gondor also reunites the kingdom, meaning that there's going to be plenty of quests for us to do all throughout Eriador, hopefully getting new areas in like Sarnford and things like that being added to the game, so that we can really explore all of Eriador and see it finally reunited. And that would just be fantastic, seeing Gondor reunited with Eriador and how that incorporates with the Shire and everything like that. And while we're on the topic of the Shire, they do reclaim it in the Scouring of the Shire. And then also Sam becomes mayor, and there's all sorts of awesome stuff that goes on there that there could be, fantastic plot lines. And speaking of the Shire, eventually the hobbits and others do eventually make it off into the Grey Havens and then sail on over across the sea. And so, there's plenty of content that could be potentially happening there where we could actually finally see the Grey Havens and things like that, which I know is kind of a minor thing, but it's still pretty cool that we might be able to see that as well. There's also finally the reclaiming of Moria, and so that will be taking place as well. I know you've thought that, we just kind of moved in, there's just an expedition force. Well, eventually there is a kingdom that is reestablished there inside Moria, which is fantastic. Can't wait to see all of that stuff, along with any other stuff that we could be doing here in Wilderland and all sorts of stuff in Mirkwood and places like that. And then there's places farther to the north, so we could be getting, more places like Forakeller stuff up in Forodwaith. I think it would be cool if we went really far north, even farther than Forakeller, and just see what crazy stuff is up there. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, well, that's all great, Andang. I know that, Saruman comes back and then he gets defeated, but after that, there's basically no more evil in Middle-earth. Tolkien's story finished, there's nothing after that. Well, not exactly. Tolkien did actually write about this dark tree, which is essentially a figurative tree, or maybe even a literal one, that talks about how evil is basically always going to have its roots and be around in Middle-earth, and there's no getting rid of it entirely. And in fact, he did explore this idea with a topic that he didn't end up completing, but he did explore the possibility of there being a new evil rising, and it actually is talked about by characters in this rough draft that he had inside Gondor. And so there's this rising group of cultists that are actually worshipping Morgoth, who is the real evil in Middle-earth. Sauron was not. He was just this guy that came along after that wasn't as strong, who also worshipped Morgoth, by the way. And so basically, eventually, at some point, it's quite possible that Morgoth could eventually come back. If LOTRO was to explore that, that would be amazing. But in the meantime, there's something else I want to point out. So I did want to talk a little bit about what I think LOTRO's biggest strength is, and that is making up its own stories within the world of Tolkien, where they have, these entire complete spin-offs about stuff that's going on that has its own villains and own complete storyline. And for the first 50 for sure levels of the game, we were basically doing a completely made-up story by Turbine. Angmar Rising and all that stuff was made up by the LOTRO developers. And so the entire first 50 levels, which many people would argue is the best part of the story LOTRO's ever had in Volume 1, all that stuff was completely made up. They didn't have to rely on the book. They didn't have to worry about how many more pages there are that are left. They didn't have to worry about any of that stuff because it was their story. It was their story. And so I think that is LOTRO's biggest strength, not only through the first 50 levels, but also into Moria. It was all their own story. It wasn't until we got to Lothlorien that they started to tie in the Fellowship, now that we finally, re-caught up with them. We did a little bit in Rivendell, but really in Lothlorien, that's where we started to catch up with them. Then we went on to Mirkwood, which is part of the books because it's, the start of the War of the Ring and things like that. But then we went, all the way back over on the other side of the world, down into Inadwaith and Dunland, and that's all still part of the books. So they started to focus a little bit more on the books, but they were still telling their own stories. Then we went to Great River, still telling their own stories. When we got to Rohan, especially West Rohan, we started to follow the plotline of the books as our main focus of the story, because it's so epic that how could you not? And so there wasn't as much of the original story taking place. And that continued pretty much all through Gondor, where, there were these side plot lines, but the main focus was following the books. And, that continued all the way through and potentially, well, definitely did continue on into Mordor, and will probably still continue on a little bit later. But in Mordor again, they're starting to tell their own story. And I think that is where LOTRO is the strongest. I've not done enough of Mordor to know if for sure Mordor is the strongest in that regard. But in general, that's LOTRO's biggest strength, is creating their own stories within Tolkien's world. And so, the reason I'm bringing all this up is because the majority of LOTRO is completely made up. It doesn't rely on the books. They don't need the books. They're telling their own story within Tolkien's world, and in many cases are telling more interesting stories, especially if you already know the story from the books. And so, because that's the case, LOTRO could literally continue on for as long as the developers want to support it. There is literally no lack of content that could possibly, potentially even take place within LOTRO's world, unless they got the rights taken away from them. But, you know, they've been able to renew that every single time so far, and so there's no reason to think that that's going to go away. That's just normal business practice, as they say. And so the only way that LOTRO's really going to end is if people stop playing the game, and the game stops making money. That's really the only way it's going to end, because there is plenty of content that they can not only make up, but build off of what's already in the books. There's still a ton of storyline, including invasions of Harad and Rune. And so, plenty of content there, because Harad and the areas that we take over in Harad are far bigger than all of Gondor, which took multiple years to go through. And then that's not even including Rune and everything that goes on there. So there's still tons and tons of content just within the current Middle-earth map, let alone if they then expanded on to do other stuff outside of the map area, similar to other MMOs that, you know, continue to expand their map further and further along into unexplored areas entirely. I think it would be amazing to see Standing Stone Games make an entirely new area that has no description from Tolkien at all. It's just their complete made-up area that takes a lot of Tolkien ideals and puts them into the area and develops them in a really good way. After they've had all this experience of taking Tolkien stories and adapting them, they really understand Tolkien's world, I think, and being able to apply that to actual zones that would be completely made up by them, I think would be just absolutely amazing and would utilize some of their biggest strengths. And so basically what I'm saying is the books really don't matter in LOTRO, because some of the best storylines have been when they're not following the books. They're still adhering to the rules of Middle-earth and the rules that Tolkien established, and the different lore events that do take place they make sure to cover, but they're telling their own story in places like Angmar and basically all of Eriador, and, you know, places all over Middle-earth. They're telling their own stories, and I think that that is LOTRO's biggest strength. And so it really doesn't matter that Sauron's defeated, because there's still, and according to Tolkien, there will always be evil in Middle-earth. And so there will always be enemies to fight, and as long as Standing Stone Games continues to be funded and continues to be creative, there will still be stories to tell within Middle-earth. And so I don't think there should be any fear that Standing Stone Games will run out of stories to tell anytime soon, because first of all, they haven't even gotten close to telling all the stories from the books within the rights that they currently own in the Lord of the Rings. And so I think that there is plenty of content to come, not only just in the remainder of the Third Age, but also into the Fourth Age. And so the only real chance that LOTRO will ever be shut down is if it no longer makes any money, which in a 10-year-old game is potential to happen at some point. It's just a question of when that's going to take place. But a lack of content, or the license being renewed, or anything like that should not be an issue, because the license has been renewed every single time, and there is so much content left in Middle-earth that has been unexplored. In fact, the majority of the landmass within just Middle-earth has still not been covered. And so there's still plenty of content for at least 10 more years for LOTRO to be telling really interesting and unique stories, and if they get really creative and start to expand beyond the map of Middle-earth, they could be telling interesting stories until the end of time. So there is really no limit on content in LOTRO. The only limit is if they continue to be supported by the fans. Thank you everyone for watching this video. I know it was a little bit different than normal, but I had gotten so many people commenting about this particular topic that I decided I have to cover it in a video. And so that's why I made this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a like. Let me know in the comments down below what you think, and if you agree or disagree. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again real soon for more content.